All right, we'll go ahead and begin. This is the lecture on Saint Juliana of Liège, or Mount Cornillon, and the vision of Corpus Christi. We'll begin, as always, in prayer. This is the collect for Corpus Christi. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O God, who in this wonderful sacrament has left us a memorial of thy passion, grant us, we beseech, to venerate the sacred mysteries of thy body and blood in such a way that we may ever sense within us the fruit of thy redemption, who livest and reignest. Amen. Father and Son, and the Holy Spirit. Okay, so just a note in advance, I'm going to do the best that I can, but I think I have the most recent variant of COVID, which has this delightful amount of drainage that creates a sore throat and unspeakable coughing. So I'm going to do the best I can. I think I can get this. If there ends up being a large break for coughing, I'll do the best that I can to mute it so that you don't have to suffer with me. So what we're looking at tonight is a particular saint who isn't very well known today, Saint Juliana of Cornillon, who is basically the founder of the feast of Corpus Christi. In the history of Corpus Christi, it gets associated mostly with Thomas Aquinas because he ended up writing just the absolutely magnificent office and mass for Corpus Christi. But he was coming into the picture about 50 years after the story begins and after the death of the visionary founder of Corpus Christi, Saint Juliana. And the story of Saint Juliana is just remarkable. Quite often when we have saints' lives and stories of visionaries, the presentation somehow gets stripped of its historical context, and we have the presentation of this figure that's absolutely amazing, and it's a fantastic story, always the way the individual life is touched by the grace of God. But quite often it comes at the expense of the historical context, and we end up losing quite a bit of the individuality of the person. The similarity to other saints gets stressed, but the particular unique individuality that, of course, is the hallmark of Catholic anthropology, that we are all specifically intended individuals created by God for a particular function in the universe, in salvation history. And that particular function is hard to understand if we remove somebody from the historical circumstances in which they're born into, in which they experience their call to God, and in which they quite often struggle against the realities of the secular world. And especially the further back in time the saints go, the easier it is not to whitewash over their past, but to just kind of cast it to the side. With Saint Juliana, what we have really is Europe at a crossroads. Her life goes from 1192 to 1258, so most of this is the first half of the 13th century. This is one of the most incredible periods in the history of the church in which the lowercase traditions of the church become that which we would recognize as the church of today. The church experienced, with most of Western Europe, a fall after the fall of the Roman Empire, when Europe is divided up by the different Germanic tribes. when a functioning single government is replaced by a bunch of piecemeal barbarian kingdoms that can really only survive on plunder. Um, Once expansion and plunder is over, those kingdoms almost immediately divide up and turn on themselves. And you have a period that, I mean, it really is a dark age from about 550, 600 or so until 900. Um, it's a Europe that's cast into endemic warfare that is facing invasion on all sides. Islamic armies coming up through Africa, invading Spain and Sicily, Viking raids on Northern Europe, raids of the Avars and then the Magyars coming in from Central Asia, taking the same route that the Huns did in the destruction of the Roman Empire. The church has to navigate this. And to speak of the church as a single institution, it can be kind of misleading in the early Middle Ages, simply because the communications that you're dealing with make having a single institution that follows the same customs, the same traditions. It's basically just impossible. And as Europe is struggling for survival, as the kingdoms of Europe are being divided amongst themselves, warring with each other, being divided with invaders, the church presents the only thing that really unifies Europe at this time. The belief in Christ, the belief in human redemption, the belief in salvation history. But it's hard to develop a coherent message for that when the entire world of the European church is constantly at war. In the history of Europe, the year 1000 pretty much marks a pivot point where Europe kind of coalesces finally, major kingdoms set up with some kind of stability. The invasions are stopped. The Vikings, the Magyars are converted to Christianity. Muslim raiding from in the south is no longer really an issue. And it's after the year 1000 that Europe begins to rebuild. And for the first time since the Roman Empire, you can speak of a shared culture that runs the length of Europe, from the parts of northern Spain to the eastern borders in Russia. And as Europe develops a single culture, the devotion of individual Christians undergoes a tremendous upheaval. If you look at early Christian art, and by early here, I'm saying before 1000, what you very much see is an emphasis on Christ the ruler, Christo Pantocrator, Christ the ruler of all, the Christ who sits in judgment of the world, who divides the saved and the damned. After about 1100, you begin to see a spirituality that focuses much more on the humanity, and that is to say, the suffering of Christ. It's after the year 1100 that the crucifixes are no longer depicting a kind of static figure that's quite often clothed, as you see in earlier crucifixes. After 1100, when you get into the Gothic era, that's where you have a realistic depiction of Jesus Christ, the man who was tortured, crucified, and died a hideous death. Those crucifixes come out of this time period. And it's not because there's some macabre interest in suffering for its own sake. It's not that the medieval world was incredibly violent, so that's the only way that they could see Christ. It's because this is the period that develops the idea of the imitation of Christ as the ideal lifestyle, the ideal for all Christians, not just monks, but also for the laity. And the religious transformation that occurs in this time period is to a very large extent driven by lay Christians and women that enter into groups, not what we would recognize as um, a nunnery or a convent in the traditional sense. These are adult women that come together for the purpose of living a religious life together. Um, they vow themselves to each other to celibacy, to works of charity, and to prayer. Usually what will end up happening is the larger communities will accept a rule and they'll end up accepting the governance of a prioress, and the prioress or abbess will be under the direction of a male prior or someone official within the church. But what we have that's absolutely remarkable is this push in lay piety that there just isn't a whole lot of evidence for before this era. So Juliana of Liège is not unique in the sense that the 13th century is literally filled with female mystic saints. In the 13th century, something like 70% of the saints who are not clerics are female mystics. It's an age in which the hierarchical church deals with a lot of problems. It gets tied up into politics. It gets tied up in worldly affairs. It's female mystics that are experiencing visions that quite often speak out as a curb on the excesses of the higher clergy that are not living up to the standards. And this isn't a modern interpretation of it. This is what writers of the 12th and 13th centuries believed themselves. Almost all of the female saints that come out of this period have their lives, the lives of the saints, the vita. Almost all of them have vitae that are written by men, and the way that most of the men interpreted the particular female saint that they were writing about and their role is that they were given a particular message by God to teach humility and obedience to higher clergy, to the nobility in the secular world, to the rich and powerful men who most desperately needed lessons in humility. If we think of Catherine of Siena in the late 14th century, going forth and basically telling the Curia and the Pope what's wrong with what they're doing and the need to return to Rome right now. Catherine is, I mean, she's of course unique in what she does in her particular way, but she's coming at the end of a long tradition. And it goes back even before Juliana of Liège. What's unique about Juliana is that her vision has the calling for a particular new feast that needs to be accepted by the universal church. It's not a general condemnation of bad practices. The Middle Ages is just filled with condemnations of bad practices of the higher clergy. That's where every medieval heresy starts. And in a sense, it's also where you get Dominic and St. Francis, not an angry verbal condemnation of certain lifestyles, but the lifestyles adopted by Dominic and Francis are examples of a different kind of Christianity, a Christianity that embraces poverty, a Christianity that embraces humility. The moment in Dominic's life in 1206, when he sees a cardinal and an abbot going to have a confrontation with Catholic heretics, and he sees the great pomp and glory that they're traveling in, Dominic recognizes that you will never win the people, you'll never win the hearts and minds of people back as long as the image that they see of the church is one of luxury. And so that's why Dominic adopts poverty and simplicity. And the whole point of the Dominican order is to be useful to others. Juliana of Liège is completely within this tradition, the tradition that's opposed to power and arrogance and replaces it with humility and obedience. Where she comes from is important as well, because as we're talking about Europe at a crossroads, as Christianity is transforming itself into a more popular devotion of lay piety that desires experiencing the suffering of Christ and finding unity with Christ through suffering. There's also huge political changes in Europe at this time, mostly between the Holy Roman Empire, which, although the Holy Roman Empire will last until the 17th century, the Holy Roman Empire by the year 1200 is already a bit of a relic that does not function. And opposed to that is the Kingdom of France. The Kingdom of France in the year 1180 is pretty much confined to this little blue section here. That's about the only land that the King of France had absolute authority over. Over the period that will go from 1180 and extend through Juliana's life, the King of Paris is able to basically put down all of the local lords, the counts of Flanders, of Champagne, the dukes of Normandy, the Count of Anjou, the Count of Maine, all of these great nobles who had basically ruled as independent princes for a couple of hundred years. What happens in Paris is similar to what had happened in England a century earlier, and that is the building of a nation state. Liège is caught in between these two worlds, the emerging nation state of France on the one hand, and the Holy Roman Empire on the other. And this is just the northwest corner of the Holy Roman Empire. Voltaire, for all of the terrible things that he said, had one very, very good comment about the Holy Roman Empire, that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It ends up being basically the successor state to a part of Charlemagne's kingdom. When Charlemagne dies, his son is able to rule the entire kingdom. But when it comes to his grandsons, the division has already started. Because Charlemagne's kingdom was like most early medieval kingdoms, it required expansion and plunder to keep everybody happy. And the moment that more plunder stopped coming in, all of the lords who provided soldiers decided that they wanted to be independent. So by the time of Charlemagne's grandsons, the single kingdom is divided up into three parts. West Francia becomes what is now the Kingdom of France. That ends up being the Kingdom of Charles. East Francia is the Kingdom of Louis. That basically is what is Germany. In between the two of them is the kingdom of the eldest son, Lothar. He gets the title emperor, but he has a land that in Italy he has no real control. And he has the land in between the kingdoms of Charles and Louis, both of who end up having much more capable descendants. So this borderland that is Lotharingia is the Rhineland. And basically, this is the land that France and Germany will fight over from 843 until 1945. And that's just the last time land changed hands. There's no reason in the future it can't swap over once again. The Alsace-Lorraine comes directly from Lotharingia. And Lorraine in this time was divided up into two parts, upper and lower. Lower Lorraine is mostly what today is now Belgium and the Netherlands. Liège is pretty much right in the middle of that. So technically, it's part of the Holy Roman Empire, which is a German empire, except it's an empire that's basically composed of a bunch of princes who basically ignore the emperor unless the emperor is actually in their city, and they expect to pretty much be left alone the rest of it. Liège is technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, but culturally it's France. It's French. The language that they speak is Old French. When the life of Saint Juliana is written, one of the things that makes Saint Juliana so unique is that her life was actually written by a woman. There are very few hagiographies, that is, the saint's life, works of the saints, that are written by women. Even through today, that's the case. And every single work written by a woman in the Middle Ages was assumed at some point in time to have actually been written by a man. The life of St. Juliana, as we have it now, is believed by scholars to be a Latin translation of an Old French original, and it's assumed that that Old French original was written by Eve of St. Martin's, who was one of St. Juliana's closest companions, sort of her spiritual protege. And since it's a saint's life about a woman written by a woman, it has certain features that are kind of unique. When they wrote saints' lives in the Middle Ages, again, the idea wasn't to do a biography on a specific person in a place and time and show how their life was influenced by events around them as a modern biography. The point of a saint's life was to show how this particular individual was touched by God. And the best way of showing that is by showing a similarity between this individual and previous saints. So there's certain formulas that tend to be used, that there's some kind of particular moment when the child is in the womb that the mother becomes aware that this child is special, this child's blessed in some way. Early in the child's life, the child shows themselves to be a prodigy. They learn Latin very quickly. St. Juliana is recorded to have memorized all of the Psalms, the Song of Songs, 20 of St. Bernard's sermons in Latin before she was even an adolescent, so before the age of 12. But one of the things that we have recorded in her life that's so unusual for female saints is how intelligent she was. For whatever reason, male authors of saints' lives about women tend not, we can guess whatever reasons we want to, but just the historical fact is that male authors tend not to talk much about the intelligence of female saints. Whereas the intelligence of Saint Juliana of Liège is described all throughout the work. The crossroads of Europe that we find in Liège, as I was talking about the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire, is that Juliana comes of age in the 1210s. She has the great vision that she has is in the year 1210 when she's 18 years old. That is the year in which the last really great Holy Roman Empire emperor of the medieval period comes to power, and that is Frederick II. And Frederick II, through incredible good luck, basically inherited the Holy Roman Empire from his father's side and inherited the kingdom, what's delightfully titled the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which is the island of Sicily, but also southern Italy. He inherited that from his mother's side. And Frederick II was brilliant, arrogant, saw himself as a man of destiny and saw himself as greater than everyone around him. And that included the Pope. And by inheriting both the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Frederick II had the Papal States literally surrounded. And when he ran into arguments with the popes, he did not hesitate to declare war against the popes and against the Papal States. So throughout Juliana's life, there's an emerging struggle between the empire and between the papacy. For those of you who've read Dante, this is the fight between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs who supported the Pope and the Ghibellines who supported the Holy Roman Empire. The Kingdom of France ends up very solidly on the side of the papacy. But we don't just have a political crossroads, we also have a socioeconomic crossroads. That in this period, we're also seeing the end of the traditional feudal aristocracy as the undoubted rulers of all of Europe, and we see the rise of the merchant class. European trade in the 12th and 13th centuries takes off and surpasses what trade in the Roman Empire had been for the first time. Lots of places get incredibly wealthy very quickly. These include the cities of northern Italy, but it also includes this whole area that is Upper and Lower Lorraine, as Belgium and what's now the Netherlands become a huge trading center for wool, which was by far the most significant export that was produced in the Middle Ages. So as Liège is divided in loyalties between the Holy Roman Empire that it theoretically belongs to and the Kingdom of France that culturally it fits with, within the city of Liège, you also have a division between the old feudal aristocracy and what are called the burghers or the bourgeoisie, which that term, I mean, after Marx, that term just doesn't really work to make any sense of history. When we're talking about the burghers, we're talking about the people that lived in the city and lived off of trade. With their mounting wealth, they take control. Most of these cities, Liège is not one of them, but many of the surrounding cities began to be sort of independent republic city-states. And that's what happens in northern Italy, and it's what's starting to happen here. And Juliana of Liège, while she's having these visions, she also gets caught up in a world of incredible political, socioeconomic, and church political change. And she's caught right in the middle of it. And so her life basically has to ride with the ebbs and tides of who is in power. The house that she's at, is the prior of that house a supporter of the feudal aristocracy and the empire, or is the prior of that house a supporter of the papacy, the Kingdom of France, this new capitalist economy? And that line ends up cutting not just through the city of Liège, but sometimes through individual families. So what I loved so much about this story, and I'm going to take a break here in just a second to try to calm my voice down a little bit, is for those of us living today in a world that is almost identical to what I've just described. Political divisions that are tearing places apart. Divisions within the church about the role of the church, the role of the laity, the kind of devotion that is proper. A world that economically seems to be standing on a precipice of incredible change from the unipolar world dominated by the United States and free markets for the last 40 years. These changes all work together. You can't separate something and say, this is just a church question, this is just a political question, this is just an economic question. The church is, by its very nature, part of the world. Not of the world, but a part in the world. And it's going to be caught up. And when we speak about the church, to speak about it in that singular is, again, misleading. Whose church? Whose vision of the church? For a contemporary, it's not always clear which voices are representing the authentic church and which voices are representing ideas that are schismatic or heretical. That only becomes perfectly clear for the laity after it's no longer an issue. So Juliana of Liège is experiencing these visions in a time that's in a lot of ways remarkably similar to our own. And so putting her story and her experience of Christ within this social, political, economic conflict that formed her life and that her vision very clearly seems to be a response to. For me, that seems the particularly timely way of approaching Corpus Christi. So since I've been talking nonstop for a half an hour here without going beyond slide 3, I'm going to pause for just a couple of minutes. If there's any questions at this point, since it's a pretty large crowd, I'm just going to keep everybody muted. That's to save individual embarrassment for when you accidentally turn on the microphone button and suddenly we get to hear about your household's issues. But if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in either the question and answer or the meeting chat. Okay, now that I'm done coughing, I'll turn my microphone back on. So the question in the chat is, would St. Juliana then be considered a Cistercian sister? So technically, St. Juliana was a premonstratensian, and that is a particular order of nuns that comes out of the 1120s. So it's very recent still in her day. And they had adopted the rule of Saint Augustine. However, and one of the really fascinating things about Juliana is just all of the connections that she has with every level of society. Although she is following the rule of Saint Augustine in her house at Mount Cornillon, she's very closely associated with the Dominican order and with the Cistercians. One of the, I guess we would say, the real heavy hitters, Hugh of Saint-Cher, who ends up supporting her cause, supporting her vision, supporting the idea of Corpus Christi, is the Dominican provincial who works for 3 popes, Innocent, Alexander, and Urban IV, works for 3 popes, all of them numbered the 4th, and is personally familiar with Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, and spends, I believe, 6 years as a papal legate in the Holy Roman Empire. And what that means is a papal legate has the full authority to speak in the name of the Pope. Um, he has full papal authority with him. And he ends up basically starting almost his journeys in Liège and then ends up preaching um, this vision and the virtues of this new feast of Corpus Christi all throughout Germany. And so right from the beginning, it has a particular attachment with the Dominican order. Um, there's not much evidence that Juliana herself ever met Hugh. She might, but she's also then associated with the Cistercians because she ends up being exiled from her house twice. When there's a supportive prior, she ends up being the prioress of Mount Cornelion. When there is not a supportive prior, she ends up being exiled. And in 1247, the exile that basically will take up the rest of her life comes when a new bishop comes into town and undoes everything that the previous bishop had done. The previous bishop, Roberts, was a full-fledged supporter of St. Juliana. In 1247, he's replaced by a bishop who persecutes her, basically. And she spends the rest of her life going through various Cistercian abbeys. Because she was able to have friends in high places, and this is her being able to work at the highest levels and the lowest levels. One of her closest followers was a Beguine, which are basically lower class women who want to devote themselves to a religious life. One of her followers, Eve of St. Martin, was an aristocratic woman who basically introduced Juliana to everybody important in Liège. One of her other supporters was the Abbess Imene, and the Abbess Imene was abbess of a Cistercian, the female side of a Cistercian abbey, and she was half sister to the Archbishop of Cologne, who's one of the most important figures in the Holy Roman Empire. When Juliana gets kicked out for the last time in 1247, Abbess Imene is the one who is successfully able to place her in a series of Cistercian monasteries. So those were the monasteries at Robermont, Val-Benoit, Val-Notre-Dame. Somehow, the new Bishop Henry was able to sow enough bad will that she wasn't able to stay at any of these Cistercian monasteries for long term. She was on her way to, her final stop was going to be in Namur. But then a weird story that I'll explain later on, she ends up being kicked out of Namur as well when Abbess Imene did not take a recommendation of hers, and the city ended up going into a full riot and destroying the abbey that was there. And the last place that she ends up is at Fosses, the Cistercian abbot at Fosses, where she dies in 1258. So although she was not a Cistercian, she ends up living amongst Cistercians for the last 11 years. And her will was that her body be buried in a different Cistercian abbey. So not strictly a Cistercian sister, but probably more familiar with the Cistercian abbeys of northern France than almost by definition, any actual Cistercian sister, since an actual Cistercian sister would have been tied to one place rather than moving around. And another question about the slides, I can absolutely create a PDF of these and email them. So going over her biography once again, and the lecture kind of has to go in these circles. Trying to do it linearly through her life would be impossible just because there's so many threads to try to keep track of. Juliana, with respect to women's spirituality, with respect to 12th and 13th century reform, with respect to divisions in the church, divisions in France, divisions in the Holy Roman Empire. I'm going to try to sort of just follow one idea through, but we'll circle back again and again, just because it's, to me, the way that makes the most sense. So she's born in Retenay, which is a village right outside of Liège. Her parents were wealthy, but they were not aristocrats. So they would have been something like the landed gentry, perhaps. They owned significant amount of land. They did not have an aristocratic title. And in this world, to be an aristocrat doesn't mean that you're rich or that you own land. It means that you have a title to the land that is hereditary, that comes with a coat of arms, and that you're recognized by other aristocrats as such. In a class-based society, bloodlines matter more than wealth. They matter more than land. It's suggested that she had some relation to the Abbess Emene, who protected her later in life. But it's also entirely possible that the Abbess Emene was just an admirer of her spiritual vision. In 1197, her parents died. So she and her younger sister are brought to the leper house that's attached to Mount Cornillon. And Mount Cornillon was a pre-Monster house that is just outside the walls of Liège. So it's not actually within the walled city, it's just outside of it. And she's accepted into this community because her parents basically were able, with her parents' death, she brought a dowry of 250 hectares of land. So with the donation of that land, she's accepted into the community. And the House of Mount Cornillon has a couple different groups of people. There are the actual lepers that have active leprosy that are being tended to. There are those whose leprosy is no longer active, so they're no longer contagious. But in the Middle Ages, just because you're contagious doesn't mean that you stop being a leper. You're still pretty much going to be an outcast. So those people, they're capable of doing work, and they want to work. They had to be, taken through their illness. They want to be, like everybody, they want to be productive members of society. And then with them, there are groups of men and women. And it's not quite clear when the men and women of Mount Cornillon adopted the rule of St. Augustine. In 1232, they reaffirmed it, but it's not clear exactly when, whether it had been an Augustinian canonry from the beginning. And that phrase there, Augustinian canons, is that men who are following the rule of St. Augustine, strictly speaking, aren't monks, they are canons. What the church decided in 1215 is that they had to have some way of not limiting the lay piety that was exploding in this age, but sort of directing it in one way or another, because if you don't direct lay piety, the experience in the Middle Ages is that a lot of those groups end up becoming heretical. The idea of the imitation of Christ, the apostolic life, the desire to follow the life of the apostles as described in the Acts of the Apostles. Um, it catches like wildfire in this time. And of course, if you have a group of people who have sort of bound themselves together in the desire to live a religious life, but there isn't any oversight from the church hierarchy, um, lay piety and lay zeal can very quickly be subverted into heretical fervor. And that's what happens in France throughout the 12th century, is that you have a lot of groups that are inspired by the idea of the apostolic life that end up making some very incorrect conclusions about what the apostolic life means. And they end up holding that if they are the ones who are living the life of community and poverty that's described in the Act of the Apostles, then they have spiritual superiority to the church hierarchy, which features a lot of very rich bishops, cardinals, and abbots. Um, in the Middle Ages, the same families, the same aristocratic families that supplied the kings, princes, counts, dukes, etc., of secular Europe, they pretty much also supplied the upper clergy throughout most of the Middle Ages. Most bishops, most cardinals came from aristocratic families. Um, and those aristocratic families, after a while, came to see having their sons placed in high positions in the church as sort of one of their rights as an aristocratic family. Um, and if you take a child who's been told from the very beginning that by virtue of being an aristocrat, they are a better person than the peasants. And that's what it means to live in a class-based society. It doesn't mean that aristocrats are wealthier than commoners. It means that aristocrats are held to be morally superior to commoners because their refined lifestyle prevents them from falling into all of the vices of the commoners, which is true to one extent. What's also true is that they have an entirely different set of vices that they fall into, mostly pride. Um, greed comes along, avarice comes along in the 13th century with the development of the merchant economy, but pride is the chief aristocratic sin. So if you have, you know, the laity that wants to lead this apostolic life and they're not being directed by anybody in the church, it doesn't take much for a leader of a group like this to say, I'm the one that's following the real apostolic life. The church leaders aren't. Therefore, I'm the real spiritual successor of the apostles. Therefore, this group is the real church. And that ends up happening repeatedly throughout the 12th century. Basically, every medieval heresy starts with a group of people that claim to be living a more perfect apostolic life. Um, and they have a lot of appeal because a lot of the upper clergy were not living particularly apostolic lives at all. They had not abandoned the sins of pride that they basically grew up in their aristocratic upbringing. So, as a way of trying to not so much stamp out heresy where it exists, but cutting it off from where it hasn't developed yet, particularly Pope Innocent III and the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 put a limit on these religious groups. If you wanted to have a religious group, you had to live under an order. And I'm sorry, you had to live under a, and the two acceptable rules were the rule of Saint Benedict and the rule of Saint Augustine. Um, my guess would be many of you have read the rule of Saint Benedict, or at least parts of it. And you're familiar with just how many pages the Rule of St. Benedict occupies. Trying to see if I have a copy on this bookshelf. Most editions of the Rule of St. Benedict are, they're their own books that run to almost 100 pages. The Rule of St. Augustine is very different because St. Benedict was writing a very specific rule to be followed everywhere as he was reforming the entire idea of what a monastery was in the West. St. Augustine wrote in a couple different places about how religious communities should live. He has a couple of letters. He has a tractate on religious communal life. And it's from these different places that you assemble the Rule of St. Augustine, which really is just a few pages. What the Rule of St. Augustine has that is a huge benefit for the people that are really moved by these spiritual movements in the 12th century is that the Rule of St. Augustine does not require removal from the secular world the way that the Rule of St. Benedict does. The whole point of Benedictine asceticism is that it's a withdrawal from secular attachments by withdrawing from the secular world. And once withdrawn from the secular world, then you can practice complete obedience to the act. That by submitting your own will, only then are you able to follow the will of God. And then as you're cut off from the secular world, you can focus your entire life around the work of God, which is prayer, meditation, and contemplation. So that works great for the monks in monasteries. Apologies. It works great for monks that are in monasteries that are set up outside of the secular world that are completely independent. The two major varieties that you have in the Middle Ages are the Cluniacs, who are known as the black monks because of their black robes, that they were the reformers in the 10th century of Benedictine monasticism, and they followed the rule very strictly. They wore the black woolen robes. One of the comments about them is that St. Benedict didn't say anything about underwear, so they didn't allow themselves any kind of underwear. They had that kind of a strict interpretation. Of course, the idea at Cluny becomes very popular and spreads everywhere, and very quickly it ends up by becoming popular, also attracting the aristocrats, and it also attracts bequests from wealthy families, and the Cluniacs end up becoming incredibly wealthy, powerful, and corrupt themselves, which leads to the 11th century reform, which are the Cistercians, who are the white monks, that they wear the white robes. And it's from the Cistercians that Dominic adopted the white robe for the Dominican order. And the Cistercians took the Rule of St. Benedict, and then they also added to it manual labor. And the purpose of adding manual labor in was to make sure that if you had the eager young aristocrats that wanted to join something popular, you don't have the aristocrats ruining the idea of reform, as many people believed it happened at Cluny. By having to do manual labor, anybody that wasn't really committed to the Benedictine ideal would end up not joining in the first place. So, many of the great names of the Cistercian order, St. Bernard, the greatest himself, come from aristocratic families. But these were the aristocrats that wanted to give up the wealth and privilege that they enjoyed. So that's the major rule for those who are living out of the secular world. But the new piety that's coming up in the 12th and 13th century is very much one that is in the world. You see this in the Dominicans and you see this in the Franciscans, that having a Franciscan convent that's completely shut off from the world in itself makes no sense. The whole point of the Franciscan order was to be part of the world, to serve the world. The whole point of the Dominican order was to preach to the laity so that they wouldn't be seduced by heretical preachers. Um, the religious movement that Juliana is a part of is very much an urban movement. Uh, so for that reason, when when these groups are told you have to adopt a rule, they all accept the rule of St. Augustine because the rule of St. Augustine is flexible enough that it can work for people that want to live in a religious community, but want to have the ability to serve people in the growing cities of Europe. Um, the Premonstratensians were one of these groups founded by Norbert of Xanten in 1120. Um, they wanted a rigorous reform of clerical life because clerical life, I mean, that's the history of the church, is that clerical life is pretty much always in need of reform. Any part of the church that has to be in constant contact with the secular world will eventually pick up a little too much of the secular world and need to be reformed. And of course, reforming is just literally going back to what it was originally. So in the 12th century, the Premonstratensians are a group that adopt the rule of Augustine so that they can have a rigorous religious community that is part of the cities, part of this emerging urban lifestyle. So this is the kind of community that Juliana is brought into. She's basically adopted by the prioress of Mount Cornelion, um, who is Sister Sapientia. And of course, it's just too perfect that St. Juliana, who is a religious prodigy, who's noted for not just her devotion, but also her incredible intelligence, is adopted by somebody who had taken the name Sapientia, that is wisdom. So Sister Wisdom is the one that guides her. Um, And it's under Sister Sapientia that Juliana learns to read. She masters Latin. She, again, has memorized in her childhood all of the Psalms, the Song of Songs, something like 20 of Bernard of Clairvaux's sermons. And she shows a religious devotion that has to be tempered. Um, Even as a child, she's very much attracted to fasting. And fasting it's one of the absolute keys to this 12th and 13th century spirituality. It's one of the actions that anybody can undertake, even and especially the laity. The 12th and 13th century are where the sacramental worldview of the church really is formalized and spread to the laity. And the sacramental worldview uh, to try to put it in its simplest form might be something like eternity and time come together. That's the eternal realm of God and the saints and the secular realm of human history meet. And they meet in human times and human places in concrete objects in specific people. And this is why the Eucharist ends up being so important in the 12th and 13th century, because the Eucharist is the supreme moment of the sacramental experience of God and man coming together. Uh, Literally, man eats God. God is incorporated in the very literal sense, becoming part of the body of the human being in the Eucharist. Um, and that's also why this age is the one that goes out of its way to make sure that the Eucharist is clearly, explicitly defined. Um, Before this time, there was basically one debate about the Eucharist in the West between Augustine and the 12th century. In the 9th century, there were two authors, Paschasius Radbertus and Ratramnus, who wrote a series of works about the Eucharist. And Paschasius was doing nothing new, Radbertus. He was trying to explain to the Saxons, who had just been conquered brutally by Charlemagne and forcibly converted. We quite often hear stories about the forced conversions of people, and almost never in history is that actually true. But the Saxons were one of the very, very few groups of people that were forcibly, violently converted. Charlemagne was a Catholic, but he was definitely a Germanic warrior king, and he was very pragmatic. And his empire was going to be a Christian empire. So when he finally subdued the Saxons in 804, after 30 years of nonstop warfare, and Saxony, you'll see, is the part of the Holy Roman Empire just beyond the border of Lotharingia, Saxony right here. Charlemagne was just very clear that everybody had to accept baptism immediately or they would be beheaded. Anybody caught worshiping the pagan gods after baptism would be beheaded. Any suspect that the old pagan ways were being followed was a death sentence. So for a lot of reasons, the Saxons weren't necessarily filled with the same fire of piety about their new religion. But they came to accept it as inevitable. And for sort of the first time since the fall of Rome, there was the question of how do we catechize a formerly pagan people? How do we teach them? And it was in this setting that Radbertus wrote what the Eucharist is. Because to pagan Saxons, what would be really important is understanding that God has the power to create with his word. That's something that's in any polytheistic pagan religion, the gods cannot, strictly speaking, create. The gods in any polytheistic religion, whether it's Greco-Roman, whether it's Nordic, Germanic, the gods are created beings themselves. The gods are part of the cosmos. They're immortal. They have superpowers, but they are not God. They are not a creator. So for the pagan Saxons trying to understand the Eucharist, what was important is the idea that Christ, simply by saying the words, "This is my body," was capable of transforming matter into something else. So Radbertus wrote a tract about how this actually happens. A few years later, Ratramnus, who's another monk who was writing a work for Charles' grandson, Charles the Bald, was answering a couple questions that Charles the Bald had about the Eucharist. Number one, does the Eucharist transform the wafer into the historical body of Christ? And question number two, is this done in truth or is it done spiritually? And Ratramnus said that it was not the historical body of Christ, that it was transformed into the body of Christ in truth, but not the historical body. So basically, Ratramnus was denying the real presence in the way that we understand. He certainly defined for himself his belief as the real presence, but it's one that was rejected by everyone else. Um, Again, so that's the one person between 400 and 1200 who rejects the idea of the real presence as the Eucharist being Christ's real historical body, that the sacrifice of Calvary is reenacted, not just signified as a symbol by the Eucharist. In the 12th century, this idea comes up again, and as the 12th century is really trying to solidify a sacramental worldview rather than a symbolic. The symbolic worldview is what most people have. It's not what the church taught, but it was the worldview that was just accepted because it was easier to understand that this thing stands for that, this stands for this. It's allegory. The entire world read as allegory. Um, and of course, you still see that in the Middle Ages, um, the like bestiaries, books of animals, where certain animals stand in for other things. The pelican stands for Christ. The unicorn stands for Christ as well. Um, but what the sacramental worldview is not saying that something that we see here points to something else. The sacramental worldview says that the eternal and the temporal actually meet. And they meet in the sacraments, they meet in religious in revelation. That these two worlds actually come together and they meet in physical objects, and revelations can be given to specific people. So making sure that the Eucharist is understood properly in this sacramental worldview, that it's not what was described as sort of a gross kind of realism, that we understand that when the priest speaking as Christ transforms the host into the body of Christ, what we have is a moment in which our temporal reality is merging in this moment with eternity. That's the sacramental worldview. And to have that idea fully taught really required having an extremely clear description of exactly what was happening in the Eucharist, which is why Western Christianity has just so much more that's written philosophically about what the Eucharist actually is, because of this very specific need to make sure that the sacramental worldview is being properly understood. Because you can see in Retramnus in the 9th century and in most of the heretics of the 12th century, you have a malformed sacramental worldview. That history is history and what happened before is gone and past, and it cannot affect the present. That's the basic idea that is behind most interpretations of the Eucharist as just a symbol or a signifier, is that time and eternity cannot meet, essentially. um, I'm going to stop for a second so that I can have another coughing fit and try to restore my voice. If there's any questions, please, in the chat or question and answer. Excuse me again. This form of COVID is like 40 times more annoying than anything else. Just really obnoxious coughing nonstop. Been about 10 days now so far. So coming back then to Juliana and what she's learning, the world that she's coming into is the world where the sacramental worldview is being fully described so that it can then be disseminated by the clergy to the laity. Um, and one of the major purposes in this is so that the laity won't be uh, won over by heretics. And one of the major reasons for supporting Juliana's vision that we'll get to in a second here is to combat heresy. This is the age of Eucharistic miracles. They still happen, of course, I'm not saying that. But the frequency and the insistency of the Eucharistic miracles in this time period are serving a very clear purpose. So in 1210, Juliana is at prayer and she has a vision. And the vision that she has is what's depicted here. And I've also chosen that as the background. She sees a full moon, but there is a bit missing, what's described in the Latin as fractione, like a little fractured part of it, a fragment, is another translation of that same word. A fragment of the moon is missing. And Christ speaks to her. And the explanation is that the moon is the church and it's perfect in its splendor, except for it's missing one thing. It's missing one feast. And what it needs is a feast that is devoted to the body of Christ. And Christ tells Juliana that it's going to be her job to get the entire universal church to accept this feast. And what is wonderful about the life of Juliana is that it doesn't paper over the incredible stress, the incredible sort of heartbreaking reality that comes through in this. Whatever her idea of her life had been before, she's told by Jesus that her job is to speak convincingly to the hierarchical church that in theory she's not even supposed to address. And she has to convince them that they're doing something wrong, and that she has the solution, which is the addition of this final feast, the feast of Corpus Christi. An 18-year-old girl. And it's impossible not to think of the Annunciation, in which Mary receives the words from the angel Gabriel. And the only response is, be it done according to thy will. But Mary ponders these things in her heart and doesn't have a full response to this until she encounters Elizabeth, where the Magnificat comes out. And the Magnificat was something that was very dear to Juliana. Later in life, she ended up composing a hymn about the honeyed sweetness of the Magnificat for Abbess Imene, when Juliana was in her own period of exile. But Juliana had the personal experience of knowing what it is, the crushing reality of being selected by God for a very specific role. Hers isn't as piercing as Mary's, of course, none is, but it's still a command that causes immense suffering. She's given what seems to be an impossible task. And she, of course, tries to talk Jesus out of it, saying that she's not possibly worthy of this, that this is a job that Jesus should give to one of the priests who will be listened to and who has the ability to spread the message. And Jesus says, no, it cannot be a message for the clergy. You are the one that's chosen for this. And it takes Juliana 20 years to process this. 20 years of doubt, 20 years of continued visions. She's not let off the hook. Um, but things don't move ahead until the year 1230. And it's wonderful that which appears in her life, and the life of Juliana is written by her follower Eve of Saint Martin, and this is about Juliana sharing this vision with Eve. And it's almost certain that Eve is the first person that Juliana shared her vision with 20 years later. Eve was 10 or 15 years younger than Juliana. So their relationship it's fascinating that on the one hand, Juliana is clearly the spiritual superior and Eve is sort of her disciple in a way. But they also have a level of equality between each other. So when Juliana had finished telling her story, the recluse Eve was nothing less than astonished and beseeched her, saying, "Please pray to the Lord that he will deign to grant me the same feelings that you have for the sacrament." To which Juliana responded, "I will not do this, recluse. It would not be good for you. Your humanity could not bear this without breaking down. For this is what has entirely weakened my body and destroyed my humanity. Nevertheless, God will grant to you and all of his other friends such feelings as will be useful for you, measuring out the portion that you are capable of comprehending." And it's just such a beautiful moment that's described here. Keeping this mission that in some way she has been, I don't know, maybe dodging isn't the quite the correct word, but 20 years of uncertainty of how she can possibly fulfill this. 20 years of, is there another way? Can you tell some priest, someone that will listen to? So 20 years of suffering. Her Eucharistic devotion was total. The fasting that she adopted early in childhood wasn't a fasting. Yeah, the fasting of medieval women, it wasn't a fasting to harm the body, to mortify the body for the sake of inflicting some kind of self-punishment. The fasting that's described in every case of the medieval women who fully embraced it was a fasting because they could no longer be satisfied with earthly food. That the Eucharistic devotion was so strong in her that only the Eucharist was food that satisfied her in any way. Her fasting, she regularly went through long periods without any food, but she would very regularly eat nothing until after Vespers during the day. And of course, one who fasts that much is going to suffer in the body and mind, and of course she did. Um, but it's this suffering. The suffering isn't sought out as punishment of the body, and that's what so many people just misunderstand about the female ascetics who are drawn to fasting, is they see it as some kind of self-hatred of the body that they're trying to punish, and that's not what's described by any of them at all. It's on the one hand a kind of physical suffering that allows them to come closer to the suffering of Christ, and on the other hand, it's a rejection of any food that cannot fully satisfy because only the Eucharist can. And so Eve, who has been drawn to her for some time and drawn to her spirituality and her devotion, wishes that she could have the devotion to the Blessed Sacrament that Juliana has. And Juliana responds with what had to have been also a devastating line for Eve to hear. to wish that you could do what your spiritual master, to experience what your spiritual master does, and to hear your humanity could not bear this without breaking down. This is what has entirely weakened my body and destroyed my humanity. So we have 20 years of this entirely internal spiritual struggle that finally comes out and is shared with Eve. And we have this idea that those who don't understand what it is to be a visionary think that it's something that they would very much like for themselves. But the visionary herself in this case, explains that this entails a burden that you absolutely do not want to wish for yourself. And you wouldn't want this burden because it's not your particular burden. God will grant you and all his other friends such feelings as will be useful for you, measuring out the portion that you are capable of comprehending. And eventually, almost all of Juliana's close companions end up sharing in the visions. They share them in different ways, but they all have incredible Eucharistic devotion. And Eve is what's called an anchoress, that she's living on her own at the Basilica of St. Martin. And this is again where we have to cycle back to the politics, both the imperial and regal politics and the church politics. Liège in the Middle Ages had 26 different parishes. It had 7 collegiate churches. So a collegiate church is a church that has the canons regular. That is, they have priests who are living a communal life under the rule of Saint Augustine. It had 2 Benedictine abbeys, it had a cathedral, and there's also a bunch of scholars, clerical scholars, who are studying at the various schools in all of these abbeys, churches, and cathedrals. Because when we talk about schools in the 12th and 13th century, don't think of a building. When we talk about schools in the 12th and 13th centuries, you have to think about a particular master that students come to study specifically under them. And once they become popular enough, they have to find room to host their lectures in, and that's when the buildings come into the picture. But the idea of a medieval school, a medieval university, is not that it's an institution with buildings. It's an institution that forms around scholars who want to study under a specific particular master. The Dominican order came to Liège in 1232, so they would have, the Dominicans immediately set up schools everywhere they went. It's, just what Dominicans do. The Benedictine Abbey certainly had a school. The cathedral absolutely would have had its own school, because the origin of the university is the cathedral school. That the cathedrals all had schools where all of the instruction for the clergy of the cathedral had to take place, in that school. Everyone who's going to be part of the cathedral had to know church law, had to know theology, and this is where it was taught. That's what ends up becoming the universities later on. So Liège is it's a very important city. It has all of these schools. It has all of these scholars. And the particular church that Eve of St. Martin is attached to is the Basilica of St. Martin. St. Martin has 30 priests that are referred to as canons, and they're living under the rule of St. Augustine. They accept Eve in, and she lives on site. The traditional medieval image of an anchoress. And the anchoress means that it's one who's living by herself, basically. She's living by herself, but in a church, she's probably she's depicted as talking to people from like some kind of balcony within the church. There's a physical separation between her and the townsfolk, but there's some access that they have to her and her wisdom. She also, because she's very well known and comes from an aristocratic family, is on very good terms with the canons of the Church of St. Martin. And because it's the Church of St. Martin, St. Martin of Tours is one of the saints that's associated with the French monarchy, going back to the Merovingian kings at the fall of the Roman Empire. The Capetian kings who took over the French crown in 985 also associated themselves with St. Martin. If you have a church in a town that's between France and the Holy Roman Empire, the Church of St. Martin is going to be the church that's allied with France. And this is where Eve introduces Juliana of Liege to the canon who is named John. And there's two different Johns in this story. The canon John is the priest of the Basilica of St. Martin, who knows all of the scholars, all of the theologians, all of the high-ranking Dominicans who are in town. And the way that the propagation of Corpus Christi is explained in the Vita, the life of Saint Juliana of Liege, is that Juliana speaks to Canon John, and she asks him, "This is the vision that I've had. This is the message that came along with the vision, that Jesus wants a feast to honor the body of Christ." She asks Father John to present this vision and the explanation to the theologians, the leading thinkers, basically all of the higher clergy of the city of Liege. And according to the life, they hear it, and they all agree that there's nothing in this vision that is opposed to doctrine or theology. And of course, when it comes to private visions, it's not up to any of them to say this is an authentic vision. Their job is to evaluate it and determine whether it is opposed to anything that the church teaches. And if it's opposed to anything, it can be immediately dismissed as a false apparition. In the life tells us that everybody immediately approves of this. From the other documents that we have, it's not likely that all of this happened in 1230, as the life kind of suggests. Most likely, Juliana herself did not speak to Canon John, that is John of Lauzon, directly. Most likely, Eve took the message to John of Lauzon, and John of Lauzon would have shared it with important people as they came through the city. But Liege was an important city, so important people end up going through there regularly. When the Dominicans set up their church in 1232, there are the friars Giles, John, and Gerard, who are important members of the Dominican order, especially for northern France. And they all agree that there's nothing in this vision that's opposed to doctrine or the faith. In 1238 is one of those really important years for Juliana, because in that year, the bishop who had supported her dies. And he ends up being replaced, not immediately, but after a 2-year wait. And that 2-year wait is due to politics. A city like Liege has a bishop prince. So what that means is the bishop is also the secular lord of the city. And if your title is Prince Bishop, you're coming from the aristocracy. So what had to happen is that the canons of the cathedral, um, and the Cathedral of Liège is always or very frequently in opposition to the Basilica of St. Mark. So that's just another one of the conflicts that you have in Liège. The canons of the cathedral cannot agree on a candidate that's acceptable to everybody. So for 2 years, there is no bishop in Liège. During that time, however, the Bishop of Cambrai, Guillard, comes into Liège in 1238. Basically, the Pope had sent him to try to sort things out and get a bishop elected. While he's there, John of Lauzon shared the message with him, and he agreed that there was nothing in the vision or the message that would be opposed to faith, that there's nothing in this that would prevent people from believing it. But in 1240, they finally appoint a bishop, and this is Robert of Perret. Um, Eventually, the Pope had to intervene, and a pontifical council chose him. Um, since he was selected by the Pope, he's immediately going to be opposed by the Emperor Frederick II. In 5 years, the Pope will have the Emperor sort of officially rejected in the Council of Lyon. Usually what had happened is that the canons of the cathedral elected a new bishop, the Pope approved of their choice, and then the Holy Roman Emperor technically invested the bishop with the symbol of authority. That didn't happen in this case, so this is a bishop that is going to be seen as siding kind of factionally with the Guelphs of the city and with the urban merchants of the city. The urban merchants of the city have some claim on Mount Cornelion. Originally, they were allowed to appoint 2 administrators that took part in directing the House of Mount Cornelion. When Juliana had been made prioress and someone who was sympathetic to her had been named prior, they kind of kicked out these members of the city and managed their own affairs. So when a bishop who was sympathetic to the city came in, the very first thing that they did was demand that their administrators go back into Mount Cornelion. And they also got rid of the prior that was sympathetic to Juliana. They replaced him with somebody, a prior, Robert, who was held to have gotten his office through simony, that is, that he paid for it, which is entirely possible because a lot of offices in this age were purchased through simony. But the first thing that he does is get rid of Juliana as prioress, and basically makes her an exile. While she's in this first period of exile, John of Lauzon remains in Liège, and he's able to continue talking about this feast to everybody that comes through town. And the most important person for the history of Corpus Christi that comes to town is Jacques de Troyes, or Jacques Pantaleone, who is the Archdeacon of Liège. The Archdeacon is a member of the bishop's staff in the Middle Ages that would be something like a combination of vicar general and chancellor today in a diocese. He's the most important, most powerful person in the cathedral after the bishop. He is the Archdeacon of Liège for 6 years. And while he's there, he's very much impressed by the story behind Corpus Christi. And Corpus Christi is officially approved for the first time while he's there. And Jacques Pantaleone ends up becoming Pope Urban IV. he has a stop as the Patriarch of Jerusalem for a while. He's elected in 1261, and in 1264, he is the one that gives the first universal adoption of Corpus Christi, using his office as Pope. And then in 1240, Hugh of Saint-Cher visits the Dominican house because Hugh of Saint-Cher is the provincial master for northern France. And then he ends up being appointed as a papal legate throughout the Holy Roman Empire. After the church had basically deposed Frederick II of being emperor in 1245, they sent a papal legate to go through the entire Holy Roman Empire, explain what the Pope's rationale was, and basically ensure the fidelity of the Holy Roman Empire to the Papal States, to the Pope, to the papacy, instead of the Emperor Frederick, who was now a heretic and had been excommunicated for something like the sixth time. Frederick II probably has the record for most excommunications. He was once excommunicated for not going on a crusade because he had his army ready to go on crusade, but a disease broke out, so he couldn't take his army on the boats across the sea while the army was sick. So he got excommunicated for not going on crusade fast enough. And then when everybody healed up and the disease left his army, he then went on crusade and was excommunicated for the second time for going on crusade while being excommunicated. After that, after 1230, he kind of stopped taking excommunication seriously. So in 1245, it was very necessary to send a papal legate through the Holy Roman Empire. And that's what the job of Hugh of Saint-Cher was. And as he's going through the Holy Roman Empire, he's sharing with them Corpus Christi and what a fantastic new feast this is. And he also stops in Cologne. And while he stops in Cologne, he meets Albertus Magnus, who is the Dominican master at Cologne. And this is also while Thomas Aquinas is studying under Albertus Magnus as his student before he finishes his doctorate. So he absolutely shared his enthusiasm for Corpus Christi with the two of them. Had ahead about 18 years, and in 1264, when Jacques de Pantaleon is Urban IV, he's in the city of Orvieto, which is just north of Rome. My guess would be if some of you have gone to Italy on holy pilgrimages, Orvieto might have been one of the towns that you stopped in. It's north of Rome, and a lot of the 13th century popes had their summer residences there. While Jacques de Pantaleon, Urban IV, is in Orvieto in the summer of 1264, that's when he makes it a universal feast. And Thomas Aquinas is with him at that time. And that's when Thomas Aquinas ends up writing the Office of Readings and the Mass and for the feast. And that's what's used. And we're doubtlessly familiar with Thomas's writings on Corpus Christi, because those are what are used for adoration today. Tantum ergo sacramentum. And forgive me, the brain fog of COVID is preventing me from remembering the other one off the top of my head. Tantum ergum is used at the end of benediction and at the beginning of Eucharistic adoration. Okay, so COVID does have brain fog. I absolutely cannot remember the hymn we sing at the beginning of Eucharistic adoration. It's a fantastic thing for me to forget on a lecture about Corpus Christi. I'm sure somebody will remember that and type it into chat. Yeah, Salutaris Hostia. Thank you. Salutaris Hostia and Tantum Ergo Sacramentum um, are both bits that are taken from longer hymns that Aquinas wrote. And I have those in slides. I'll go ahead and include those in the PDF that I send out after this. Um, 1247, um, Juliana is outcast again with a new bishop. This is when she begins her life in exile. So although Bishop Roberts had approved the feast in 1246, it hadn't really caught on. In the first time that the feast was celebrated at St. Martin was in 1254. Juliana spends the rest of her life as an outcast, going from Cistercian monastery to Cistercian monastery. Basically, she would have had to believe that her life was a failure. Um, she had done everything that she could to promote this, but it had been opposed by the cathedral canons during her first time. When she was able to return, it had been approved in 1246, but it hadn't even spread to all of the churches of Liège, far less the entire church. The suffering that she endured in those 20 years, that it must have appeared to her in the 1230s that there was a chance that she could fulfill this mission. In the 1240s, as relatively high rank, not relatively, extremely high ranking members of the church are offering their support to this, it must have looked for a brief moment that things were set up for everything to fall in line. And then in 1247, she's exiled again. Her friends are cast out. Her opponents are able to follow her into exile, basically, and prevent her from being able to stay in one place at a time for more than a few years. As she's bouncing around to these various abbeys. The abbey that it looked like she might have been able to stay at, that the abbess Imene had been able to install her at. This was at Namur, which is it's within the same area. What had to have been a moment that just seemed like all of her life summed up at once is while she's in Namur, she's trying to convince the abbess Imene not to get too close to the Countess Margaret. The Countess Margaret is the daughter of Baldwin IX from an extremely illustrious family. But Margaret was the sister-in-law of one of Frederick II's wives. So just having that unintended marriage allegiance to Frederick II was enough to make the Countess Margaret incredibly suspect in the eyes of all of the supporters of the King of France, all of the supporters of the Guelphs, all of the rich urban merchants. And when Countess Margaret discovered that there was a house owned by a cleric that was being used as a brothel, she immediately had the house shut down. Somehow, this ended up being interpreted in political terms as her persecuting the particular cleric in question and her persecuting clerics that were more loyal to France than to the empire. And what happened was basically a peasant riot that went through the city, chased Countess Margaret out of it, and also destroyed, supposedly brick by brick, the Cistercian abbey that Juliana was in. And Juliana had warned Abbess Ximena about being seen as being friendly with Countess Margaret. Juliana, again, her intelligence here, she understood the political situation very well. That any friendship between Abbess Ximena and Countess Margaret would be enough for the people to view Ximena and everybody who was friendly to Ximena, like Juliana and the sisters that were put into the house, the Cistercian house there, all of them would be viewed as being basically within the same group. And Countess Ximena, I'm sorry, Abbess Ximena had given to Countess Margaret some of the relics of the Holy Virgins of Cologne, and that gift was enough for her to be wrapped into that group. So when the townspeople rioted and chased Margaret out, they also tore apart the Cistercian monastery that they assumed was associated with the Countess. This was in 1256. Ximena is able to arrange a spot for Juliana at Fosses, and Juliana dies. On her deathbed, she has a wish that her confessor, Canon John of Lausanne of the Basilica of St. Martin, had been her confessor. And they developed, through Eve, they developed confessor-confessee spiritual master relationship. She requested him to come to her deathbed, but nobody from Liège would come. And she said that she had some final secret in her heart that she had to reveal to him before her death. And it's assumed that there was something else, perhaps some final vision she had during her last years on the road. But whatever that secret is, it went to the grave with her. And then 3 years after she dies, Jacques de Pantaleon ends up being elected Pope as Urban IV. He has a short pontificate, but one of the things that he does is declare Corpus Christi to be a universal feast throughout the church. Even then, it wasn't immediately embraced in all places. It ended up being mostly a local festival that was celebrated in parts of the Holy Roman Empire. It was celebrated in Cologne, certainly due to the influence of the Dominicans there. It was celebrated in Venice because Venice had a lot of commercial ties with the Holy Roman. The Dominicans and the Cistercians both adopted it in the late 13th century. And then it was redeclared as a feast for the entire Universal Church by Pope John the 22nd in 1323. And John the 22nd, a few years later, would also canonize Thomas Aquinas. And we have it on the authority of Thomas Aquinas's confessor that the Mass and the Office of Readings that were sent along with the papal promulgation of 1323 were indeed those that were written by Thomas Aquinas. So she didn't get to see it in her lifetime. Her lifetime ended up being one of more suffering, which, the suffering of Christ was her form of devotion. And in a sense, perhaps it was right that she wasn't denied that particular form of devotion, which was believing that her suffering united her with Christ. That she was permitted to die in that state of spiritual union with earthly suffering. John the 22nd is also the Pope that made public display of the host in a monstrance to be officially encouraged throughout the church. The monstrances that we have today tend to be the solar models with the rays coming out from the host. But the style that was far more common in the Middle Ages, up to the 16th century, I believe, is what's called the tower style here, where the host is displayed within a Gothic tower with spires and and of course now I also can't remember the name of the little points that come out on the spires. I wrote about this when I was writing about the design of the Cathedral Basilica of Immaculate Conception, but of course I can't remember that particular word right now. I don't know if there are any architecture majors who can recall the particular term for these Gothic additions to spires. Perhaps I'll have to include that with something later. So it's Eucharistic adoration becomes popular throughout the 13th century, but the particular Eucharistic processions that we associate with Corpus Christi, that the great procession through the town with the host in the monstrance, with the full splendor on display. That is what comes out of the 14th century and the rededication, as it were, of this feast through John the 22nd, with the particular support of the Dominican order, and the Cistercians as well, who had been the orders that in her life she had the support of. So if there's any questions here, I'll take any in the question and answer or the chat. And the new bishop in 1247 is Henry of Gueldre. I realize between what I've said and the notes that I have here, it's not clear who exactly is persecuting Juliana at which times. Robert of Thurot as bishop was kind of ambivalent. In 1240, Robert had restored Juliana and deposed Prior Roger was the prior who had persecuted her. He was supported by the Pontifical Council, and he was the one that ordered the separation of the city ambassadors from Mount Cornelius. In 1247, the new bishop, who is Henry of Gueldre, is the one who also has papal support, but is much more further along the radical Guelph side of the angry urban merchants who want to have control of Mount Cornelius. That was the work of Henry of Gueldre in 1247, not of Robert of Thurot. So that's my mistake, just to clarify that. Henry is the one that deposes both Juliana and the prior John. That's the other John. Prior John, or brother John, was the one that Juliana basically dictated the original mass and office to. It was assumed to be under his authorship, but what the life of her says is that he wrote things down while she was in prayer and song. And what that almost certainly means is that she was creating the hymns that would be used in the Mass and in the other parts of the new feast. And he was basically taking dictation. There is, and I couldn't find a picture of this. There's a historiated initial. Those are, if you're familiar with medieval manuscripts, and the beautiful letters that they have, like the red letter day, that expression comes from those medieval manuscripts that have the huge capital letters that are in bright red and blue colors, sometimes red, sometimes blue, usually red's for feasts, and they'll have little pictures around. That's a historiated initial. There's a historiated initial of the Mass for Corpus Christi that Juliana wrote that has the image of her looking at a moon with the piece taken out. That historiated initial also has a depiction of her and Brother John writing down the Mass, and there is a dove outside of her room. And the significance of a dove outside of the room in medieval manuscripts is that implies inspiration by the Holy Spirit. So the Mass that she wrote was almost certainly hers and not Brother John's, although he received credit for it for some time. One of the things that women were not permitted to do in the Middle Ages was to interpret scripture or preach on virtue, on moral life or the faith. One of the ways that female mystics kind of got around this was by composing hymns. There was no prohibition on female mystics or nuns on composing hymns. Since it wasn't strictly speaking biblical exegesis or a sermon or preaching, they were allowed to do that. So when they talk in her life about her at prayer and song, she's composing hymns, and it was absolutely appropriate for her to compose hymns. And I will also get the copy of what she composed for Corpus Christi, and I'll send that along. That's going to take me, I have to update these slides so that they're not confusing in terms of what I ended up saying. I'll attribute that to COVID brain fog as well. Hopefully you'll accept that explanation. Oh, we're at 8:30, so there's always more to talk about, but that's the wonder of the church as a whole, particularly the medieval church, and the incredibly rich life of especially the 13th century mystics of the church. Perhaps a closing thought on the overwhelmingly important female mystics in the 13th century is that in Dante's Purgatorio, when he climbs to the very top of Mount Purgatory, he meets a character who is named Matilda. And he doesn't identify her with any other name. Some of the Italian commentators assumed that it was the Countess Matilda from the 11th century who was involved in the fight between Pope Gregory VII and the Emperor Henry IV. Other suggestions, however, are that Dante's Matilda refers to a German mystic, Mechtilde, but we can't be sure which one because there are 3 different German mystic Mechtildes from the late 13th century, all of whom would have been appropriate choices as a mystic companion of Dante at the top of Purgatorio. So the fact that that single name is not enough to narrow it down in the late 13th century for female mystics. That's the church history of the 13th century, I suppose. Thank you all very much, and I will get these slides and the other items sent out along with the lecture itself.